I think we'll get started. And we're a small but powerful group, so move to the front. This is going to be very conversational, so if you move to the front a little, it'll help. You all should sit up front. Yeah.
Will we sit in front?
Yep.
Yeah, please.
Mara, welcome here.
So I'm new to this place, to this land, and I'm learning the relationships. But we'll begin with a number of years ago, Christ the Redeemer Lutheran Church developed a land acknowledgement, and I'll read that land acknowledgement to begin our night. The Kananaka or Mohawk Nation is recognized as the custodian of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Teotike, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it's home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Greg.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Christ the Redeemer Lutheran Church, I'd like to welcome you this evening to this important event that's been sponsored by Citizens for Public Justice. We're truly grateful to see you here and gathered together as a community committed to making a difference. Tonight, we've got a good opportunity to engage in discussion about pressing issues that concern us all: poverty, refugee rights, and climate change. As we approach the upcoming federal election, understanding how these critical matters are being addressed by our different political parties is really important. Together, let's explore what our leaders are proposing and how we can advocate for a just and compassionate society. Thanks for being here, for your commitment to social justice, and for your willingness to learn and engage, as will I. Let's make this evening a good one. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
So we're streaming online. We're small enough that we wouldn't need the microphones, but for the online folks, we'll have speakers use the microphone. So you're saying welcome on behalf.
Yeah. Hi there, everyone. My name's Ian Van Haren, and I'm the board chair at Citizens for Public Justice. So Citizens for Public Justice, you'll hear a little bit more about it over the course of the evening. There is a staff team that is based in Ottawa, and then we have a national board of individuals across the country on our board, 13 of them, and we're super lucky, I think, that 3 of the board members are in the Montreal area. So I've been chair of the board for almost 2 years now, been on the board for 4 years. Jonathan joined the board about a year ago and then recently moved to Montreal. And the treasurer of our board, Paul Barry, who's not here with us tonight, actually lives on Ile Perrot in Pincourt. So he's also local to the Montreal area. So a bit of an over-representation on the board of people living in Montreal. I'm just so delighted that we have a good showing of people here tonight to hear about some pressing local issues. have a good conversation about how to approach the election. And for those of you who are maybe a bit less familiar with Citizens for Public Justice, to have, a bit more of an introduction to the organization, and I or many others would be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So thanks a lot.
So I'm on the board of Citizens for Public Justice. I'm the pastor here at Christ the Redeemer Lutheran, and I'm the former Associate Secretary, Justice and Peace, Intercultural Leadership for the Canadian Council of Churches. So with all of those hats on, I was asked to talk a little bit about why a Lutheran church would host this and how we engage in social justice. So I won't talk for more than a couple minutes, but just to say that public theology is the name given to the Christian theology that talks with the society and advocates for peace, a more just world, and boundary-breaking compassion. Our faith calls us to strive together for the common good and to invite others to do the same. I'm called back to congregational ministry after most of my career, and part of it is I believe the people that are going to church and other places of worship are radicals. And they're radicals in this society because we're living in a society where people are not doing community and they're not doing the common good. And in these places of worship, there are people who are committed to doing community, to giving time to community, to being in community, and to engaging their larger community and society. So to me, that's a group of just outright radical justice people that I'm with on a Sunday morning and other times in the church. They're radicals because we're in a time, Ruth Wilson Gilmore talked about a time of organized abandonment of the common good. It's an era of deindustrialization, the emergence of a neoliberal economy and neoliberal other ways of doing society, a dismantling of the welfare state. And I found in my work in communities, my work in the churches, that increasingly this is a society in which members of the society distrust the corporate or the common good or the communal. They see themselves as only responsible for themselves, and increasingly they don't trust that if they do for others, if they engage a community, that the community will also do for them. So we're moving into a time where people are out of survival, becoming more and more selfish. And I know the people who come tonight are not that group of people. You still have a commitment to the common good and inviting others into the common good. So into this sort of changing society, small groups of faithful people, activists, faith people, non-faith people continue to strive towards a more just society and a more just world. When churches do justice, one of the things to keep in mind is they're not telling the society what to do. And in fact, most faith communities can't agree internally or with each other on most justice issues. At the back, there's a publication of the Canadian Council of Churches, an election resource. I worked on these previously, and I know the amount of work it takes for denominations, for churches. There's a couple people, Baylan included, who's been part of this before. Any single statement is hours and hours and actually months and sometimes years of work. And so if you see churches in particular, let alone faith groups agreeing on something and making a statement, know that it's a powerful, powerful agreement, that they really aren't able to agree on a whole lot. What they are able to agree on is a vision of peace, or shalom or salam. So if you look at many of the major faith groups, they all carry that vision. How that's lived out is different from community to community. But at the core of that biblical word for peace, which our English word just really doesn't capture, is a deep commitment to right relationship with each other and with all of creation. So faith communities are committed to community, right relationship with each other, right relationship with all of creation. We feel that we're called to work for the common good and to wrestle with what that means to work towards the common good. And we feel that we're called to invite and inspire others to do the same. And so that's why we host things like tonight's conversation. I know there won't be agreement, but there will be good conversation, and that's what we hope to invite people into. I want to close with the words of Dom Helder Camara, who was the bishop in Brazil during the military dictatorship. And in his words, our faith calls us to get moving and help many others to get moving to make the world more just and more human. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. Hello, everybody. It's really great to see you. My name is Scott Cooper, and I'm with Citizens for Public Justice. I do the communications for CPJ, so if you receive emails from us, you got me to thank. What we're going to do now, actually, and Jonathan, would you mind advancing the slide one? What we're going to do now to kick us off. Well, first I'll tell you a little bit about CPJ or what we've been up to over the last month. So CPJ has held an election tour, which has consisted of events that we've held across the country in a lot of spaces like this one, but also at universities, at people's homes. It's been a really special thing. People are really keyed into justice issues right now. And the thing that's made the election tour event special is the fact that the group present has brought their concerns and their contributions and insights to the conversation. So with that, what I would like to start us with before we hear basically all of these a really like crack team of policy experts that we have sitting up here is I want to make sure that we capture some of the things that are coming into the room. So what I'm going to ask you to do for about the next 10 to 15 minutes is think about what are the issues for this community in this election. And one other thing I'll say about it is that, you know, some of the conversations on the election tour have inevitably been about how dominant news out of the US has been and how pressing those issues are. And if that's what's on your mind, then by all means, please, I encourage you to share what is on your mind. I also encourage you to share encourage you to think beyond that if that feels appropriate and important. So without ado, I think what I'll do is I'll invite anybody popcorn style free to either raise your hand or just shout it out in a word or two. What do you think the issues for this community in this election are? And I'll repeat them on the mic so everybody can hear them. And then the folks on the live stream can hear them. Does anybody want to start us off? Yep. Just the right direction arrow. Yeah. Okay. Oh, well, it's not advancing. Who knew? I mean, we know what we're doing. I think it's okay. If you can't figure it out, Jonathan, don't worry about it. Does anybody want to start us off? And also, panelists, by all means. Sure, go ahead.
I'd say affordable housing.
Affordable housing. And one other thing I'm going to mention is that while we write these, we're going to leave this up here while we have our panel discussion. And panelists, I'm going to please ask you to do on the gymnastics and acrobatics that I'm sure you're capable of doing. See if you can call out or address any of these issues that we see so that we can get the relevances to them. Does anybody else have one that they'd like to suggest? Cost of food as well. I'm sure we'll be hearing about that. I saw another hand go up just after that. Yeah.
Yeah, the sovereignty of Canada, because without that, a lot of the justice issues, equality issues, identity issues are kept up.
The sovereignty of Canada, because without it, a lot of the justice issues might be non-starters. Yes, please.
Climate change.
Climate change. We'll also be hearing about that. Also, if we need any decoding, I can tell you what these scribbles mean. Well, I've written them down. Please go ahead. Work security. Great. Work security. Okay. Divisive rhetoric. Also another good one. That one has come up at other election tour events as well. Although I can't expect that we'll hear too much of that tonight. At the back. Low church attendance. In this election. Cool. That one has not come up yet. Yeah, go ahead.
Access and quality of public health care.
Access and quality of public. Okay. This is great. We're running out of room here. Anybody else? At the back there, sitting in a group of three.
Accessibility for all individuals, you know, especially with disabilities.
Accessibility. Does accessibility just as a word capture it, do you think? For all, maybe?
For accessibility for all.
Accessibility for all. Great. Okay. Thank you for that. International aid. All right, panelists, you remember all these? We got a lot. Okay, maybe let's get a couple more. Yeah, Jeff?
I'm wondering if it's part of accessible housing, rental caps.
Rental caps. Well, we have accessibility for all. We have affordable housing.
I'm wondering if that's part of it.
I think accessible housing is worth pulling it on its own. Yeah.
Because the landlords are putting rents through the roof every single year.
I'm sure housing in all of its facets is going to come up a lot tonight. Please go ahead.
Scott, my wife is a psychologist in one of our local schools, and food programs in the schools are a big issue.
So food security, is that too,
Programs is different.
pardon me?
School food programs is different.
Yeah, okay, so it's more specific than food security in general. Okay. We are truly running out of room, and I think that probably means that I think that's telling us something. Does anybody can we maybe do one more? Yeah, please.
I would say like the widening wealth gap.
Widening wealth gap. Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much for doing that. That's a really helpful way to start this. And there's going to be a lot of time for questions and answers. So I encourage everybody, panelist or audience member, to feel free to draw on these concepts as we go through our discussion. And thank you for being so involved already. What we're going to do next is we're going to ask now that we've set that table, we're going to ask our subject experts to kind of get into it and give us an orientation about the work that they do locally. So we have sort of a set of people who work on local issues in your community here or in Montreal and Quebec more specifically. And then interspersed with that, we have policy experts from Citizens for Public Justice. And they are going to sort of pick up on the local issues that folks are working on and tell you about what work is being done at the federal level to try to make justice inroads on those policy issues. We're going to, there we go. There's the, yeah, perfect. That's the next slide. So if you scroll down one, that should go to the first one. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. We're going to structure this sort of in a way that just mirrors CPJ's 3 policy focuses. So that's climate justice, poverty elimination in Canada, and refugee and migrant rights. Great. So what we're going to start with is climate justice. And for our panelists, what I'll ask you to do, instead of me doing it, please just give us 5 minutes on what your organization does and tell us a little bit about who you are and the issues you're working on. There's a mic right there, and I think that one should be on. You know, maybe for the 5-minute part, we'll stand if you're able and want to. and then we're gonna have a good long sit down talk. So.
Hi, everybody. I'm Geneviève Lucier, and this is
Veronica Audrey Crespo. Pleased to meet you all.
thank you for the invite, first of all. So we are here representing Save Fairview Forest. Fairview Forest is a large natural space right next to Fairview Point Clare. So if you've been to Fairview, you know where Fairview Forest is. It's just to the west of it, excuse me. It was a 50-acre green space until the REM station was built in the corner of it. So now there's 39 acres left of this space. For the last 4.5 years, we've been really working very, very hard, protesting every week. We're week 232 this Saturday to try to protect the forest. Cadillac Fairview, who owns Fairview Point Clare, owns the forest. But in our attempts to save the forest, we've been in communication with municipal governments, provincial governments, federal governments, and at this point, we have protections at the semi-protections at the municipal level. There was a freeze on the forest, and there was a freeze on the Cadillac Fairview property. And at the Montreal level, there's also a temporary freeze on the property as well. So we have had some success recently in having those temporary protections, but the forest is not saved in perpetuity. There was a study done, completed in 2023 by the biologist firm Terra Humana that found over 240 species in the forest, 35 that were at risk provincially and federally. And we're still struggling to get those levels of government to offer permanent protection to the forest. So that's been our fight for the area, for that space in the past 4.5 years. The Fairview Forest is located in one of the worst heat islands, Montreal. It's got the parking lot from Fairview Point Clare to the east of it. There is a large residential development going up to the west of it on the old Merck Frost site. It's right next to the Trans-Canada Highway, and Brunswick is just to the north of it as well. So it's a buffer for air pollution, for noise pollution. It is a human rights issue, as Veronica is excellent at reminding all of us in the group. Access to local spaces is a human rights issue. In the next 10 to 15 years, we expect there'll be about 10 to 15,000 people living in the vicinity of the forest due to the density requirements due to the REM station. So within a 1 kilometer radius of the forest, there is going to be density up to 300 per hectare. However, none of it will be affordable. And so we know with the influx of population, it is a human right to have access to green space, a local access to green space for all the people moving into that area. So given the heat island, given that's the only percolating surface in the area, given the fact that it's a high air pollution zone, the noise in that area, it's essential that, and for biodiversity reasons, it's essential that we protect Fairview Forest in perpetuity. And that's what we're continuing to do and trying to bring up to our federal candidates this election to make sure that the environment is not forgotten, because it seems to be a little bit on the back burner. Unfortunately, the candidates don't seem to be talking about it as much as they should this election time. If you want to add anything.
Well, you mentioned that I like to talk about human rights, so I'll go with that. Saving Fairview Forest is more than an environmental issue. It's also a human rights issue. You know, it's certainly good to. Sometimes people seem to think that environmental issues, it's all about saving the cute birdies in the trees, which it is, and that it's really important, because without a healthy environment, without a healthy planet, we won't survive. So, for a healthy, we all have the right to life. To be alive, to have a life, you have to have a healthy environment. You have to have good health. You have the right to security of person. And all of these, without all of these, then you've got a problem for sure. And to touch on the subject of affordable housing, as Jen has just mentioned, what Cadillac Fairview wants to build is not affordable housing. They want to build, it's not luxury condos, but it's certainly not the affordable, luxury adjacent. That's a good term. Thank you. And it's not the affordable housing that everyone knows is what there's been a crying need for an innumerable amount of years. And certainly cutting down a forest also does not help with climate change. I mean, the forest helps also keep people safe in an era of climate change in terms of, this past summer, in the summer of 2024, I think it was August, there was a giant rainstorm. Without the forest being there, the entire area would have flooded because the forest absorbed all the water. And so on and so forth. So I'm probably taking up other people's time, and I'll have more time to go into other aspects later. So I'll just pass it on.
I'm not sure if it is time for me. Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. I didn't know we're starting that early. My name is Mario Wahba. I was born and raised in Egypt. I'm the climate justice policy analyst at Citizens for Public Justice, where, again, we do a lot of that federal advocacy work. A lot could be said, again, about the environmental file in this election cycle, and thanks for prefacing this by mentioning how little we tend to talk about it currently, and certainly not enough people bring it up as their top issue as we should. But it is, I think, inherently related. One area that I have been highlighting in our federal tour that I think touches on many of the local issues that already we heard about, and from you folks tonight, is the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies. So last year, in 2024, the federal government has handed out close to $30 billion in fossil fuel subsidies to the oil and gas industry. And that is money that is not spent on healthcare, that's not spent on affordable housing, that's not spent on developing our renewable energy infrastructure, on things that could ensure our independence and sovereignty, like an east to west energy grid, an interconnected energy grid that would be smart and would work to sort of moderate the supply and demand, the fluctuations in supply and demand in renewable energy generation and consumption patterns across the provinces. Things like the fast railway between Quebec City and Windsor, and in one of the most populated corridors in North America, that would save on transportation time, on emissions, other things like the Greener Homes Grant, like that would help lower income and middle income folks, help homeowners to do, you can tell I'm not a homeowner, to do energy efficiency programs or energy or heat insulation upgrades that would save them on their energy bills and would also reduce emissions. So I think the issue of fossil fuel subsidies costing Canadians also. There was an economist called Jim Stanford who's commissioned a study and found out that just over the past 3 years, the rise in the cost of oil and gas at the pump, directly and indirectly, cost each household $12,000 just over 3 years. And that's also because 25 cents out of every dollar of inflation in the past 3 years was associated to the rise in the prices of oil and gas. A lot of folks blame the cost of climate action, but the cost of climate inaction are much huger. Just last year alone, 2024, insured damages were $8.5 billion, whether that was the Jasper wildfire, the GTA floods, or the Hurricane Debbie here in Quebec. So we need to urge our elected officials to take more climate action. The cost of climate inaction is far greater than what we need to spend in order to address the issue at the cause. And one of the ways we could start addressing the issue at the cause, that smart way that saves us money and helps us to navigate these resources elsewhere, is eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. Thank you. I'll pass it on.
So the next policy area we're going to hear about is poverty, specifically the way CPJ frames it, poverty elimination in Canada. And Jonathan, if you could grab our next slide. Perfect. Thanks.
Okay, I will stand up. So thank you for the invitation. My name is Anne-Marie Aubert. I'm the coordinator of Montreal's Food Policy Council, which is the Conseil du système alimentaire montréalais. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you for having the opportunity to come out to the West Island, because we are based downtown and we don't have a lot of connections with folks out here. So I don't want to also stand in for people who are working locally, more locally than that, but it's a Montreal-based organization. We're really a network. We have a mandate from the provincial government to work with a network of partners, over 100 different organizations in the region of Montreal, to promote access to healthy food. And we also have a mandate specifically with the City of Montreal to provide advice on food policy and any program at the municipal level that could have an impact on our food system. So in terms of this election, I know that one of the points that was raised was the cost of food and in general food insecurity. As people who are working in the frontline organizations can attest, the demand for emergency food relief has gone up as much as 3 times for some organizations since the pandemic, and it just never went back down. So many organizations are completely saturated with the amount of people coming and looking for help. And it's no longer, or I shouldn't say it's no longer, but it's more and more people who have jobs, but they're not being paid a fair wage, or they don't have the kind of job stability that makes it possible for them to earn enough to feed themselves and their families without getting help from a food bank. And there's also, of course, a large swath of the population who are living on government-based incomes, and those incomes have not been adjusted to meet the actual cost of living. When we think about food in relation to the cost of housing, for example, well, it's unfortunately a lot easier to reduce your grocery bill than to not pay your rent, because you can't risk eviction. So it becomes one of what we call a compressible part of your budget, and it's the part of that family's budget that takes the hit, because it's just so hard to pass up on things that are absolutely necessary, like using your transportation to get to work or having a place to live. So the Food Policy Council was launched in 2018 after many, many years before that of mobilization, citizen mobilization organizations getting together and say, we want to have a voice. And we do work mostly with the city, but also we participate in consultations with the provincial government. And we spent a lot of time thinking about what is food security. And there's a lot of different ways that we hear in the news or in public discourse about food security. And a lot of it really focuses on that type of emergency situation where people are looking for help to get, finish the end of the month and be able to put food on the table. So imagine that everybody is here has heard about the concept of a food desert. This was an idea, a term that was coined in a lot of American cities when there was devitalization of the urban core of the city. And because the poverty level of the population was so high, businesses just shut down, and that included grocery stores. So you had this phenomenon where you might have a whole neighborhood full of people, but the grocery store chain has decided that they're not making enough money and they're just going to close it down. So in Montreal, we do have areas where it's harder to get to a grocery store, where you need to use public transportation that's not always very frequent, or you need to use a car, and that also costs you money. But when we look more closely at the Montreal specific situation, it's not so much the geographical access to the food that seems to be the determining factor as the economic access to food. So we talk about food deserts a lot, but we also like to talk about food mirage. So take, for example, right downtown in the Plateau Mont-Royal, you can walk down Mont-Royal Avenue and see all these great little boutiques and stores, and they have the friterie and all this, nice little chic food places and stuff like that. And so you're right next to the food. There's no problem like getting close to it. but for so many people, and in fact, almost 40% of the people who live on the Plateau Mont Royal, who has a reputation for being sort of a bourgeois area, 40% of the people are food insecure there because that food is economically inaccessible for them. It's right there, but they can't afford it. And another term that we like to talk about, and something that we urge the different levels of government to take into account when they're planning their different policies, is the idea of access to healthy food. Because another phenomenon, so we've talked about food deserts, food mirages, and we also like to talk about, well, we don't like to talk about it, but we have to talk about it, food swamps. So what you'll also find in certain areas where there's a higher level of poverty and the housing is cheaper, so you have people living there for different reasons than that's their favorite neighborhood. You'll also have an overabundance of fast food, dépanneur, all kinds of places that will sell cheap food, but it's not healthy food. So there's nothing wrong with going and having a bag of chips from time to time. There's nothing wrong. We're not trying to be categorical about what people should be eating and making those choices for them. But what is important is that people can have the option to buy the food that they want, and that includes healthy food, that includes fresh fruit and vegetables, for example. And so many people just don't have access to that in their neighborhood because the kinds of food that's offered are highly processed and not very, very healthy. I don't know how much time I have left, but I'm going to quickly talk about school food because it was mentioned. So one of the major files that we've worked on also is working towards a universal school food program. We're a member of the Coalition for Healthy School Food, which is a cross-Canada coalition. We have a Quebec chapter. So we are obviously very happy when the provincial government finally agreed and signed with the federal government to receive funding to invest in school food. But I guess just a few things about that. We really hope that we are building towards a universal school food program for a couple of reasons. We don't want to be targeting only the schools with the poorest families or in the poorest areas, because we think that it's a right, like you were talking about human rights. It's a right for everybody to have access to this food, and especially our kids. People sometimes don't eat healthy food at home, skip breakfast, and it's not necessarily for economic reasons. So we want to make sure that this is the first step towards building toward a universal school food program. We promote a model.
Is it like a school food program?
Yes, yeah, a universal school food program, so that every kid would have access to it, and parents could opt out if that's not what they want in the model that we're suggesting. And there would also be room for contribution from families according to their means. Healthy food also is a standard for what's served in those schools is very important also. Right now, we get a lot of food services that rely on donations, and then they basically take what they can get, and that means that the quality of the food that's offered isn't always the best. And finally, and I'll close on that, also not forgetting about the education aspect of food, because the agreement that was signed with the federal government and the provincial governments for serving food is very important to feed the kids, but it's also very important, the whole educational aspect of food, to learn about what is healthy food, to learn about what food choices are going to have an impact on the environment. That's more and more an aspect of our choices that are going to impact climate change, and also how to learn to appreciate different cultural traditions in food for their own consumption and in their communities. So school food program, it's a great first step that's been taken, but we're going to be continuing to work with the different levels of government to make sure that it really is just the first step to something that's all-encompassing.
Sorry, Natalie, I forgot to say one thing before we started this, and this isn't actually about you, Anne-Marie, it's about me forgetting it. If you have like a specific initiative that you want to talk about, or anything for that matter, by all means, tell people, ask me about this later when we get to the panel portion. I think that'd be a really effective way to do it, just to put it out there so folks know what specifically they can ask you about, if that helps to condense things. Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me here. My name is Michael LaBelle. I'm the president of the board of directors of the West Island Assistance Fund. It's a community service organization that got its existence in June of 1966 under the name Fonds de dépannage du Nord-Ouest de l'île. It was actually faith-based because they merged the social committees of several Catholic parishes back in the 60s when it was the church that supplied social services before the state got involved. And here we are. Next year we celebrate our 60th anniversary. So we're a community-based organization, free to determine our mission. We're big on food security, and we have a food counter that we have on Commercial Center Roxborough. This parish has been extremely generous to us during COVID. As I was jokingly saying to somebody, we got a bill for our truck and we're going, oh my gosh, and then a check came in from Church Christ the Redeemer that said, oh, thank you. So, we have our reality that we deal with. We have about 1,600 people receiving food assistance. The requests have doubled in the past since COVID, and 40% of those are kids under 18. Actually, because this is about, I'm going to read to you an article that I wrote with Michael Leclerc, who's with Pierrefonds Community Project, because one of the things that's been bugging me in this election is there's an issue that dear to my heart, and we're not talking about, and that's child poverty in Canada. That really bugs me. It just bugs me that I see kids that don't have enough to eat, and I'm on the West Island of Montreal, and I get really annoyed. So you'll permit me, that way I can burn up my 5 minutes, and I'll read the article. Hopefully it'll be published in the Gazette, we're not sure, but I like to share it with you, and here it goes, because this was, so it's a strong Canada begins with full bellies, stable homes, and a quality education. We often speak about building a stronger Canada through innovation, infrastructure, or economic growth. While undoubtedly important, the real foundation of any nation lies not in steel, aluminum, or GDP, but in its children. For Canada to thrive, every child must have access to 3 fundamental rights: enough to eat, a safe place to call home, and the opportunity to learn in a supportive, well-funded school. These aren't luxuries. These are basic building blocks of a healthy, resilient societies. Without them, we undermine not just individual lives, but the future of our country. Children are the foundation. The strength of a country is reflected on how it treats its most vulnerable, and that starts with our children. Every child in this country represents potential, the potential to become a scientist, a teacher, a caregiver, an innovator. But that potential withers when children grow up hungry, homeless, or poorly educated. Healthy childhood development, physical, emotional, intellectual, forms the foundation for adult citizens who will eventually shape our country, our communities, and our democracy. Supporting children is not charity. It's a strategic necessity. It's nation building. The essentials: food, shelter, education. 1, enough to eat. 1 in 4 Canadian children lives in a food insecure household. Think about that for a minute. That's 25% of all our Canadian children. That means thousands of kids head to school on an empty stomach, unable to concentrate, lacking the fuel to learn or play. Chronic hunger just doesn't hurt for the moment. It affects the brain development, emotional regulation, and long-term health outcomes. This alarming number is way too high and needs to come down. School food programs can play a transformational role in bringing this number down. A national school policy, one that guarantees every child a nutritious meal each day, would level the playing field and give every student a better shot at success. 2, a place to call home. Housing is more than shelter. It's safety, stability, and dignity. Yet too many children live in overcrowded, inadequate, or temporary housing situations. When families are forced to move frequently or live in poor conditions, children suffer. They get more easily distracted, struggle with anxiety and depression, often miss or become disinterested in learning and homework, and ultimately fall through the cracks of public systems. Thank you for your patience. A national affordable housing program, and it's affordable rents. Everybody talks about people want an affordable rent. They can't, it must become a priority, and wasn't the case after World War II. Affordable housing is just an economic issue. It's a social imperative. Secure housing means more stable families, healthier kids, and safer, more vibrant communities that can thrive instead of just survive. 3, good education. Education is a great equalizer. I'm one of those people that was lucky for the education system, but only if it's accessible and equitable. However, too many Canadian schools in low-income and remote communities are underfunded, under-resourced, and solely lacking basic supplies, technology support with students with special needs. In large urban communities where we operate, we have seen a dramatic rise in young elementary school-age kids who need more homework help, more social skills guidance, and more encouragement to offset their growing disillusionment. Funding cuts to the public education system are taking a toll on our youngest students. How can this be a good thing? Every child in Canada should have access to quality public education. That means investing in teachers, libraries, safe classrooms, and support services. A strong education system is a long-term investment in our children and our country. And the current reality, the cost of inaction. Canada is one of the wealthiest nations in the world, yet we have over 1 million children living in poverty. The cost of this neglect is staggering, not just economically, but to our very own social fabric. You see, when we fail to invest in children, we end up paying more in healthcare, social assistance, and the justice system, while opportunities for future productivity and growth are squandered or lost forever. A call for action. Various levels of government need to have the political will to prioritize kids and policy decisions. For example, upcoming federal and provincial campaigns must commit to eradicating child poverty in Canada through income support programs, universal school meal programs, and affordable housing targets. Governments must invest to ensure that high-quality public education system is available for all children, regardless of their postal codes. Community leaders and organizations must work in collaboration with government initiatives to improve food security, address housing issues, and offer educational enrichment programs. A strong society starts with these little things: a full stomach, a warm bed, and a good book in a safe, inspiring classroom. If you want Canada that is strong, innovative, compassionate, and united, we must build from the bottom up. That means starting with our children. When we give children what they need to thrive, we just don't protect their future, we protect our own. So thank you. Hopefully that might appear in the Gazette, but if it doesn't, you heard it here. So yes, this child poverty and one of this federal election campaign, a lot of issues that are just getting buried because of what's going on down south and that. And to me, when I see the kids coming in to our food bank, and Michael Leclerc, who has Careful Community Project, they do miracles on a shoestring with young children over at Roxbury United Church. It just floors me. It just floors me that I'm living on the West Island. And these kids, they come from immigrant families and they're just following, right? They're just trying to figure out, they're just, and as you say, it just really bugs me.
Thanks. My name is Natalie Appleyard, and I'm a socioeconomic policy analyst at Citizens for Public Justice. I'm also Anne-Marie's sister. So it's fun to get to be on a panel together. I guess our parents did okay. So I think hearing what was raised in the exercise that Scott facilitated, in hearing about the concerns that are top of mind for you, hearing already from our co-panelists about the environment and climate change, and from our two local panelists looking at issues of affordability and food security. And I'm sure that Wade is just like chomping at the bit to say more about it, because Wade works with Food Secure Canada, but we asked him to talk about migrant workers' rights specifically. So at the Q&A, I'm sure you can ask Wade more about food security as well. But what's coming out for me across these issues are these common themes and questions that we ask at CPJ when we're talking about poverty, when we're talking about affordability, and just policy in general. So at CPJ, we talk about this idea of public justice and working towards the common good. And what does that mean? And for us, that uses human rights as sort of the benchmark. And for CPJ as a faith-based organization, I often share with folks when I'm speaking in churches or with different faith communities that this Christian theology of the Imago Dei, that all people are created in the image of God with inherent dignity, with inherent worth, that has a secular parallel in human rights framing. It's an existing legal framework that we can use to hold governments accountable. It's an existing benchmark that we can use. And that, to me, is like the level of ambition that we should be demanding of our governments and of our leaders. And what is on offer in party platforms and what is on offer in the media cycle for this election is a real low bar. So I think for me, when thinking about this federal election, and we've been talking with people across the country, I just have to ask, like, what is our goal? Like, what do we think the government is even here to do? What do we think we're here together working towards? And to me, like that bar has been set so low. And I think governments need to be reminded of, you know, all these issues that people really care about. And I think we as a people need to be reminded that these problems are not inevitable. So we've been hearing a little bit about, you know, rates of food insecurity, rates of poverty, rates of child poverty specifically. And I'll mention that CPJ is one of the steering committee members of Campaign 2000, which focuses specifically on ending child and family poverty. And they put out a great report card usually every November around National Child Day that looks specifically at child poverty in Canada. And Campaign 2000 is so named because there was an all-party resolution that Ed Broadbent brought forward, but had all-party agreement to end child poverty by the year 2000. So that was where Campaign 2000 got its name, and we're well past that. But the other key point when we're talking about statistics about poverty and food insecurity specifically, or core housing need, that brings me back to this as a human rights issue, is that these rates are not consistent across the board, right? We've seen we do an annual poverty trends report every October around the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. And we use the most recent available statistics every year to look at people's experiences of poverty in Canada. And what we see year after year are these disproportionate trends in terms of who is most likely to experience poverty and who is most likely to experience it most deeply, right? So you can't talk about poverty and you can't deal with poverty effectively in Canada without talking about equity and without talking about human rights. You can't talk about poverty without talking about disability rights. You can't talk about it without addressing colonization, racism, homophobia, sexism. All our statistics, when we're looking at who is affected most by poverty or who is most likely to be affected by it, fall along these lines. And we know that these are not like distinct categories, right? People live at these intersections of these different facets of their identity and of the way that they walk through life. So as much as, you know, we work with many partners who provide that direct service to people to meet their acute needs on a day-to-day basis, we talk about poverty as a matter of justice, fundamentally, as a matter of human rights. And so the kinds of policies that we are calling for are those that uphold that human rights standard. So we heard, for example, already, you know, not just any housing is going to address the affordability crisis that we're facing right now, right? So much of the political discourse and media cycle is dominated by like this idea of trickle-down economics, which hasn't worked anywhere. So I don't know why we keep beating that dead horse, but you know, it's this idea that, well, as long as we're building more housing and we cut all the red tape and we just, you know, get shovels in the ground and build more, then, you know, like it just will free up the affordable housing, you know, for all these wealthy people who are, I guess, taking up the current affordable housing until they can find some new luxury condo to buy, right? Like it's absurd. But so much of our, so much of the conversation about the affordability crisis, about the cost of living, isn't actually about poverty, right? And a lot of our policies that are supposedly, or not our policies, a lot of government policies that are purportedly about the cost of living or affordable housing are really directed at the middle class and above, right? So what we're calling for are policies like increasing the proportion of the rental housing market that is non-market, affordable, accessible housing, right? That's what we need. The OECD average is 7% of the rental market being non-market affordable housing. In Canada, we only have 3.5% of the rental market as affordable housing. So we need to double that. That's again, a specific benchmark consistent with our human rights obligation. And we've heard about poverty, we've heard about food insecurity, and we know that these are matters of income as well. And we've heard that wages have not been keeping pace with the cost of living, labor standards haven't been keeping pace, and income supports have not been keeping pace either. So what we're facing right now is sort of this like 30-year debt of divesting from creating public housing, this 30-year debt of not keeping wages consistent with the cost of living, or disability benefits or social assistance benefits not keeping pace. So when you maybe hear some of the sticker shock of what it will actually cost to make adequate investment in these issues, it can seem pretty daunting, but it's just because we haven't been doing it for 30 years. And that was a policy choice, right? So there are plenty of things that I would love for you to ask me about later in the Q&A, from affordable housing to food security, to some rights-based public policy mechanisms, and what it really means for the government to uphold their human rights obligations. Well, there was something else I was going to say. Now I'm losing my train of thought. Anyway, maybe we'll see what comes up in the Q&A. But corporate control. Ask me about corporate control. Because what we are seeing across sectors, whether it's housing, whether it's this false dichotomy of environment versus affordability, whether it's migration or food policy, across all these sectors, we are seeing this preference for private profit and these for-profit models that are coming in and taking over public systems. And we're seeing this across the board, this shift towards privatization. And again, that's kind of what got us in this mess. It's not what's going to get us out of it. So I'd love to chat more about that.
Definitely ask Natalie about privatization. Our last policy area that we're going to hear about is refugee and migrant rights. Sure, yeah, if this one will reach. And this is the last one right before the Q&A. So please do think of some questions to ask our panelists.
My name is Wade Thorhog, and I'm with an organization called Food Secure Canada. And what Food Secure Canada is a convener of the Canadian civil society food movement, and an advocate for federal policy change. So it was born in about 25 years ago, when a bunch of food movement activists got together and said, we really need to have a common voice with the federal government, because if without a civil society's voice, unified voice, and we have food industry that dictates our food policy, and that's kind of been the case for Canadian food policy since the Second World War. And it's hard. It's always hard to get food on the agenda, especially in federal politics, because we have a federal government that doesn't really seem to think about food a lot, aside from making sure that we have food for export. And so part of our role has been to start to push all of government, but specifically the Department of Agriculture, to start thinking about food in different ways. So food policy, we can talk about everything under the sun, but so if you want to ask me anything about food, I'm open, but I'm going to talk specifically about migrant rights, specifically workers in our migrant agricultural worker system. So I know I'm speaking in a district that's very urban, and I know that maybe a lot of people if they don't come from a rural background, wouldn't necessarily know this is the case. I actually grew up on a farm, but I actually didn't know about the system until much later. But we have a system of foreign workers. Well, we have about 60,000 people working as temporary foreign workers in the agricultural system. And most come through a federal government program called the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program. And what this is that a farmer or a farm owner and operator can apply to have migrant workers come and work on their farm. And these workers come from specifically 12 countries in the Caribbean and Mexico. So this is a result of a society where we've pushed producers to produce food so cheaply that there's actually no supply of workers in the country, Canadian citizens or permanent residents that will actually do this work. We have to look elsewhere to bring these workers in. And there's a lot of, there are some positives that come out of this program. I mean, there's people that don't have a lot of economic opportunities in their home countries that come, and they come year after year, and some have been working in this on even the same farm for decades. But there are a lot of issues with this program that lead to abuses and basically strip people of their basic rights. So with this program, you have people that come and work with a specific employer, and their entire visa is tied to that one employer. So if they have a fight with their boss, if they don't like the conditions, they complain about it. What happens is that they can't just go to another farm. They take their visa's gone. They go back. They get sent back to their home country, and they're not going to be invited to go on the program again. So if you think about going to a job and where your job is your employer has control over your housing and your rights to be in that country, it can be pretty scary to say anything about any problems that you may see or any abuses that you might face. Employers, these farmers provide housing, but the housing is exempt from residential tenancy acts. So they don't actually have to keep them at the same standard that they would as landlords would elsewhere in the country. These foreign workers don't have the same access to services as Canadians who also work in the same country, like healthcare. They have no collective bargaining power. And they're even exempt from protections that are available in other industries, such as construction. So, your employer tells you to go up on a ladder that's not secured, that looks kind of wobbly. You can't really say no, because there's actually there's no protections there. If your employer asks you to work in a greenhouse that's 42 degrees, there's nothing you can do. And whereas somebody is working in an industry that's protected, they could say, well, no, I refuse to work under those conditions. So you can see how this system has been likened to a form of modern day slavery. And when you think about how our farming sector is predominantly white, and these are workers that are coming from largely Black and Latin American countries, that there's definitely an element of systemic racism in there. And it can be particularly tough for people who do not have a strong command of English, and particularly women who are particularly vulnerable in these situations. So there's so many different ways that we could think about reforming the system, and one of the easiest calls to action is to give people permanent residency as soon as they get here. If you're going to work in this country and you have the skills to get accepted to a program that brings you here, then why not give people the chance to shop around with their employers like everybody else does? But beyond that, there are also a lot of other calls to action that are much more specific about improving the working conditions and removing some of these opportunities for abuse that can occur. So I find this is a really strange system that we have, because in a lot of our other supply chains for different things, food and other things, a lot of times we export production of stuff to other countries and don't really think about it. And when the food or the clothes that we wear on our back, sometimes you can be an ethical consumer and look into how it's produced, but a lot of times there's just in places with laxer labor standards and protections for people who are marginalized. But this is an example of something that's happening right under our noses within the boundaries of our country. And it's state sanctioned. It's a state sanctioned program. And so I think that if we want to, before we can even get to the topic of like, how can we cajole other nations into doing better and treating their workers better, we could do a lot to improve the conditions of the people that we invite into this country to work on our farms. And this is just one example across the food system of that is very dependent on marginalized work. So if you think about who's delivering food for, on Uber Eats or DoorDash, who's working in these cramped kitchens in minimum wage, who's working in our slaughterhouses. These are people that do not necessarily have the same rights as the rest of us. So, and it's part of the bigger problem that we have a food system that pushes that where we're so dependent on. We don't have proper safeguards in place to allow people to have decent food security. So we are dependent on a system that produces cheap food because cheap food is actually keeping these people alive. But if we actually thought about a system where constructed a system where people had agency over their food system, then they could make choices and not just go with the cheapest option. But the cheap food epidemic that we're in pushes farmers to minimize costs. It pushes everybody to produce a product, and it creates all sorts of problems across the food chain. And we have an opportunity now, especially with the things that are going down south of the border, to think about how we can craft a food system that is very local, that produces food for Canadians, that is that is built into Canadian society like it was historically. But we've gone so far down a path of corporate profit and exploitation that it's really hard to come back to that. But this is just one example where, there's work to be done. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks a lot, Wade. I introduced myself before as the chair of the board at Citizens for Public Justice. My name's Ian Van Haren. In addition to that volunteer role, I have 15 years of experience working in the field of international migration. So I worked for the Canadian government for a while. I've worked as an academic studying migration issues. Right now, doing my best to finish my PhD at McGill University, and I'm studying refugee resettlement as part of my dissertation research. And I've taught a little bit about migration at Concordia as well. And up until about a year ago, I worked as the executive director of Action Refugee Montréal, which is a local nonprofit that provides support to people seeking protection in particularly the Montreal area. Action Refugee Montréal is supported by the Anglican Diocese of Montreal, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and a wide variety of community members. And we have there 3 programs, one going to the detention center in Laval, providing support to detained migrants. We do refugee sponsorship, and there's some community connections and local integration programs there. So that was kind of my day-to-day. Now I'm just trying to finish my PhD. So thinking broadly about migration policy, refugee rights, I think there are 2 key questions that kind of connect what's happening here at the local level to issues all around the world as people are seeking new opportunities in new places. And the 2 key questions would be, how many people are we welcoming from other parts of the world? And how do we treat people once they arrive on this land, right? So The how many do we welcome question has become increasingly politicized, both in Quebec and in the rest of Canada, where you have political leaders making statements about what the level of immigration should be and debating this quite publicly. Now, since 1991, the province of Quebec has had quite a bit of autonomy over immigration. There was an agreement signed in 1991, the Canada-Quebec Accord on Immigration, which gives Quebec quite a bit of control. So in some ways, some of this becomes a provincial issue, right? And we're talking about a federal election right now. But the federal government is still responsible for setting the national policy, for controlling the borders, for running its operations as it relates to Canada's immigration system. On the how many do we welcome question, we have to distinguish and think about permanent immigration and temporary immigration, right? Both government controls these types of programs. And maybe ask a question to echo what Wade is saying. Why are we giving people temporary status anyways? You know, when my grandparents immigrated to Canada, which was in the 1940s and 1950s, my grandfather came from the Netherlands and worked on sugar beet fields in southern Alberta doing agricultural work, but he came as a landed immigrant. And when he arrived, he was told, you have the full rights. And within a few years, he was a citizen. And I completely echo what you are saying. So many people now, and it's a trend that started in the 1970s and has accelerated, are welcome to this country with a temporary status, which leaves them in a precarious situation if they want to ensure that their rights are respected or they want to work for a different employer. Right? So Citizens for Public Justice has called at different times for a status for all type of movements to say, we don't want people on temporary permits, we want them to have permanent status within Canada. But then how many permanent immigrants are we welcoming, right? And this is an emerging issue for, I think, two reasons. One, you have an increasing number of Canadians who want their family members to be able to immigrate to this country. Maybe a parent still living in another country, a close family member. And the demand for family reunification is exceeding the number of applications the government is allowing to be issued visas each year, which means the waiting times are getting longer and longer, and people are getting frustrated. Similarly, with refugee sponsorship and refugee resettlement, there's many people, churches, mosques, community organizations who want to welcome newcomers, and the government, both provincially and federally, has said, we can only take so many each year, and as they limit the number of visas that are issued, the time it takes increases, and the system it starts to falter, and people lose trust in the government because they say, you have created a broken system on purpose, right? So we can call to increase the number of people who get permanent resident status in Canada. Of course, that's a contentious issue. Some people will say, we're not ready, we're not able to handle this, but I think that we can push in that direction. Let's go to the second issue. How do we welcome people once they get to this country? Again, in Quebec, there's a lot of autonomy for the provincial government, right? The francisation courses are run by the provincial government, and there's an agreement where the federal government sends a lot of money to Quebec to run local integration services. But at both the provincial and the federal government, we can call the government to say, let's be welcoming, let's set people on the right path when they arrive in a new country. There's a lot to adjust to, but we can set up programs that say, here, this is what you need to do. We'll provide you with not just a language course, but a daycare so that women will also be going to the language courses and not staying at home with their children, right? Smart policies that ensure that people are stepping onto the right foot as they arrive in a new country. Just a few other points here. So there is what's called the Immigration Holding Center in Laval. That's run by the Canada Border Services Agency, and people end up being detained for immigration purposes at that center. Here's some progress that the last government made. They passed a bill which added oversight to the CBSA to say we can investigate if there are problems in how you are treating migrants in this detention center. That's an important step for government oversight of how its agencies are treating vulnerable people, but we need to see that implemented in a greater way. And we can question, How often are people being put in migrant detention and does it make sense for them to be there? Citizens for Public Justice is called a few times to say we're relying far too much on detaining migrants. That's not the type of country that we want to be. So we have to make sure that there's clear oversight of any of these types of policies. And then just a final broad point. Of course, when new people come into our community, there's periods of adjustments and we learn how to live together and get along. And diversity, I think, is a richness that can really enhance communities, but we have to watch out to make sure that politicians are talking about diversity as a strength rather than trying to divide or create division among people, right? And we have seen some examples of political rhetoric that tries to play on difference or divide communities. The government can have a really important role in supporting initiatives that help us learn how to understand each other, build community, and kind of build barriers between different communities. You know, one example will be the Supreme Court hearing of Bill 21, what's happened in Quebec, where the government has passed laws prohibiting the wearing of religious symbols for some public servants. And it will be interesting to see how that plays out. I certainly have my personal position, which says this is a horrible law, but there's a wide variety of opinions, of course, in this province on that. So whether we're thinking about the municipal, the provincial, or the federal government, if we're thinking about immigration policy or how we create a welcoming society, there's lots of work to be done. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Ian. There we go. We're back. Thanks so much, Ian, and to all of our panelists. That was terrific. I learned a lot. I hope everybody else feels the same. I'm really excited to hear about like the diversity of tacts we have on the issues. So right now we have about 30 minutes for a question and answer period. So I would encourage you to think about what some of the panelists suggested that you might ask them, some topics. Anything that you thought got overlooked or that you wish you heard more about? I think I lost it again, didn't I? How about now? Okay. And lastly, if anybody wants to call back to the list we made earlier about what the issues are for this community in this election. And Jonathan, can we just advance one slide too? I think it just says Q&A. Not that we really need to be told that. Okay. Would anybody like to kick us off? Yeah, please. And sorry, and once again, if you can, I'll do my best to hear the question and then I'll repeat it for the room.
So this is a question that's linking the immigration and the food security and inequality question. I was really struck by something that you said, Wade. It was talking about like a lot of the exploitation that we see in the temporary agricultural worker program has to do with our desire or the need for producers to produce cheap food. But then linking to the other discussion with the cost of living crisis, some of us, myself included, may be thinking, nodding along to that, but then also thinking, wait, what cheap food? Because we're saying, like, we don't think of food as cheap these days. So it was more like a, how do we explain some of that? And because I think we're reliant on this exploitative program, but then there's other comparable countries, I'm thinking maybe of continental Europe or Australia or other places where it is known that groceries and basic food items are cheaper. And is it just that it's not as linked to this program and the production of food because most of the food we're producing is for export, so it's disconnected for our prices? Or is it a corporatization question of profits of a middleman? Or is it like, how do we kind of explain that when we see that kind of like apparent, at first glance, like kind of contradiction in that?
You know, did we hear that in the microphone, in the headphones? I think it honestly, I think it very well have come through on the live stream. So I think we're okay to put it to the panelists just like that. And I'll give. Sorry, wait, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. Yeah, so it is hard to say like, yeah, food is cheap, and I know that some people are going to like question that. We are paying less as a percentage of our disposable incomes for food as any generation that preceded us. Well, maybe 5 years ago it was a bit different, but yeah, we pay about 11% of our disposable income is on food, and going back to like the 60s, that was probably more like 20%, and then going back to the 40s or 30s, that was, you know, potentially half of your budget. But I think that, like, for me, the key here is because food costs are are most felt by people with the lowest incomes. If you can correct that issue, then we can start to talk about you know, paying farmers better. But so long as we have acute food insecurity, then we can't. It's hard to really say, like, oh, you know, we need to be paying farmers better. We need to be paying our food producers, the people along the food chain, better, because there's that portion of the community that's spending, you know, potentially up to half of their income on just on food. And that, but I mean, that to me is a solvable issue. Is if you just have proper income equity policies that bring up the purchasing power of that population, so that they can make the right choices, then we can have conversations about the rest of the food system. But yeah, we don't really. There's still politicians and policymakers that will try to obfuscate the issue and say, well, it's not really like an income issue. But no, so long as we make or leave the market to control our food system, then it is an income issue. Absolutely. So, does anybody else want to?
I'll just go over here for now. Okay, I don't want to block you. Yeah, and I think also, like, it's not just about farmers and then consumers. You've got a whole bunch of people in the middle who are, you know, running the distribution and the retail of the food system. And that's where a lot of the profits are getting concentrated. Like, it's not the farmers who are getting really paid necessarily that well for what they produce. And especially when you look at farmers who are on a smaller scale, who are doing more sustainable agriculture, they are really suffering. And but one of the things we can think about in connection between both the consumers and the producers is the issue of basic income. So the Food Policy Council, we just took a position in favor of basic income, which is making sure that everybody receives sort of a minimum amount to cover the cost of living. And obviously, when you think about people living with food insecurity, it's kind of a no-brainer. Okay, well, yeah, that's going to help. Okay. But we also think about what it would do in the rest of the food system. So what would it mean for those farmers who are working on a smaller scale, who aren't relying on migrant workers, who are choosing to do more sustainable practices, organic food, etc. Well, a lot of the time they get sort of kind of squeezed out of those good practices because they can't afford it, and because they're the ones living with poverty and food insecurity. So, you know, increasing that kind of basic income, yeah, it's going to help anybody who's living in food insecurity, but it also might help the people who are making the positive changes in the food system be able to hang in there and actually be more resilient and thrive and be better, bigger part of transforming that system.
If I could, Natalie, do you have something you want to add? Okay. Could I throw it to our climate panel just before? I wonder if I can put you guys on the spot. Is there a climate relevance for this kind of question? Like, would a government that cares about these issues, yeah, please grab the mic. Would a government that cares about these issues, like, what kind of decisions would you see them making?
It's on? Okay, good.
Yep.
So I think in terms of food, we have to think of what is food. In terms of the production of food, we have to think in terms of climate, because with more climate change and more radical weather events and all these things, it's going to become more difficult to grow food, and that's more expensive, and that feeds into affordability issues. So I suppose in terms of what the government should do, it would be simply to take action against climate change and save Fairview Forest, obviously as a small part of that, but engage in just conservation in general, because again, without healthy ecosystems, we can't survive. food will not grow reliably. It'll be more expensive, and so on and so forth. So there's a connection there for sure.
Just as a side issue, the conservation of biodiversity. You're speaking about monocultures, or diversity is a strength, and so biodiversity is a strength, and so it speaks to the the larger issues of the food industry at large. I think if we think about it in the future, and so a lot of those issues that we see on the board there are connected. So I appreciate you asking. I don't know if
Yeah, Natalie, did you have, or Mario? Sorry, go ahead.
One of the other major nation building projects that we talk about that could be funded if we were not to spend $30 billion a year on fossil fuel subsidies is a youth climate corps, and that's a jobs guarantee program. It's proposed as a sort of first year. It would be only for 20,000 people. It would cost about $1 billion to give them a living wage of $25 an hour, and that would go to employ folks in either low carbon jobs, which include checking up on seniors or healthcare in general, or agricultural jobs that have relatively low carbon emissions, or they would include retrofitting, home retrofits, installing solar panels, battery packs, or energy insulation, as I mentioned earlier. So there are different aspects where you can, again, increase the employment of young people, and all of this would be for people below 35 years old. So that would, who are suffering from double the average of unemployment rate. I think people below 35 are about 12.3 of them. 12.3% of them are unemployed, whereas the average unemployment rate currently is 6.4. And so we would be addressing unemployment, youth unemployment, we would be addressing emissions, and we would be addressing job security, which some folks have mentioned, all while also making that our food supply chain is functioning with more integrity, because we're paying our workforce, our labor force, a living wage.
And thank you for talking about youth, because I think another, in terms of the environment and climate change, another thing to take into account is our youth. Because every action, every decision that the government makes affects our descendants, the people that will be here after us. And youth have the right to a future, no? So, and when we think of what is the role of government, the role of government is to care and protect its people. And if it doesn't protect the environment, it's not fulfilling that job. If it's not, and it's not ensuring that this planet will be livable for future generations. And we certainly, I think we can all agree that none of us has the right to steal the future from our society's children. That doesn't fly in the slightest.
Did you have a final thought before we take another question, Natalie? Yeah, sure. Why don't we keep going? Or Jonathan, we have one over on the other side of the room. I might take that one. Please, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I got lots of questions, but I guess I'm going to ask the gentleman that focuses on climate. Year after year, the oil and gas industry is getting billions of dollars in subsidies. And part of the reason they get these subsidies is because they have very powerful lobby groups in Ottawa. These lobby groups meet with politicians just innumerable times throughout the year, so they have tremendous power. And obviously the lobby groups have lots of money. Now, green groups or environmental groups, there's lots of groups across Canada, but they don't have the kind of bucks to have a powerful lobby. So my question is more about process. How can we deal with the lobby groups in a way that we can strengthen the environmental voice of the groups that are concerned?
That is such a fantastic question. You got me fired up enough to stand up, which I should have done earlier given how short I am. That is a great question. And I'm glad you really took me there because, so one thing, maybe some of you are sitting there and wondering, like he's been given 5 minutes to talk about the environment. Why did he waste it on talking about fossil fuel subsidies? Such a narrow issue, right? A few reasons. One of them is to sort of try and shed that reputation about the environmentalist movements that we're naysayers or that we're anti-development. It's absolutely not the case. We are pro renewable energy, for instance. We are pro building east to west interconnected energy grid or the fast railway project. But it is also so important to highlight that this is an industry that does not in the slightest need our public dollars. They, between the years 2019 and 2023, have increased their operational profits from $6.6 billion, the oil and gas industry in Canada, to $66.6 billion. That's exactly a tenfold increase in just the span of 3 or 4 years in operating profits. And they don't need, and they get our public dollars. One of the questions that I've been asked on the tour is how exactly do we subsidize them? We don't know if any public money going to straight to fossil fuel industry or oil and gas companies. No, we do that in quite a few ways. One of them is buying the Trans Mountain pipeline, which cost about $35 billion in and of itself. And another one is Export Development Canada, which is a crown corporation that facilitates concessional loans or loans that are below market rates to oil and gas industries to facilitate their exports. We do that by carrying the cost of cleaning up abandoned wells from the oil and gas industry, where they set up an operation to extract oil from a certain place and then they leave it behind, and it's we usually see that happen more in Alberta, and it's on the public expense that it has to be cleaned up. And again, in various ways. So what do we do about that? That was the second part of your question. One, support places like Citizens for Public Justice and our campaign. So that's a great plug for our annual Lenten campaign, which just ended with the end of Easter. It's called Give It Up for the Earth. And every year we have an open letter that we collect signatures on, and we take those signatures of people like you, and we go meet with elected officials in Ottawa, and we tell them these are the voices of people. And if we have members, if we have signatories who are members, it's even more, and that's another plug for CPJ. Any financial donation, no matter how small, makes you a member of CPJ for a year. And when we show up in the politicians' offices, we could say these people are serious about these demands because they're not just a signature on a petition. They're people who donated money in order to make their voices heard. So that's one of the ways we can strengthen our collective voice, by showing to elected politicians in Ottawa that it's not only the large lobbies, fossil fuel lobbies, that care enough to pay people with their exorbitant amounts of profits to go and lobby for the private interests of shareholders of oil and gas industry, but it's also everyday Canadians that care about the beautiful environment of places like Jasper, that care about their homes and insurance costs going up, that care about food costs going up, and that want to see climate addressed, that care about youth employment, that want to see climate issues addressed. So please join Citizens for Public Justice. The membership card is in the back. Sign up the Give It Up for the Earth. You can come talk to me after the event, or you can find it on our website. And yeah, keep talking about it to friends and family. People trust their friends and family, and that's the only trustable way that we can change politicians' minds.
Thanks, Mario. Yeah, please.
Can I just say really quickly that in the next week, before the elections, if you see your candidates, ask them why they're spending, why the Liberal government, let's say, is spending that much money. And if it's a Conservative candidate, then ask them what they'll be doing about subsidies, if they will be subsidizing the oil and gas industry, and why that money is not put into biodiversity protection like they're supposed to. The Liberal government particularly has made promises about protecting 30% of our national territory by 2030. That's 5 years away. That's not a lot of time. They've also committed to protecting, to making 10 national parks and 15 urban parks before that time as well. So hold our candidates accountable, ask them what they're doing to protect biodiversity, about fossil fuel subsidies, and just keep hammering away those questions and keep whoever gets elected accountable for the promises that they make.
Great, thanks guys. I think I would love to get another question in, just to make sure that everybody gets to ask what they would like. Do we have another one in the room? Please go ahead.
Scott, I have one.
Yeah.
You're going to have to help me formulate this because it's sort of
Alrighty.
spinning in my head.
Sure.
But here's what it is. If the polls are anywhere as close to being accurate, we're probably looking at a Liberal government in about a week. So what I would like to hear from the point of view of climate, poverty, and migration status, is there any good thing that you guys see in the current Liberal platform that is something that we can be happy with or comfortable with?
Well, I wonder if we should put the question to the panelists about a particular platform and say, could I suggest maybe could we talk about what would a government that is acting in the right way, what would you want to see them do? And you can flag whether that's something that is part of the Liberal platform. Is that a fair way to put it?
We could, but
Yeah.
I think we're sort of past that point right now. I mean, whatever it is that we're going to do as a group of concerned people is going to have to be done in the presence of a newly elected government.
Sure.
So I'd like to kind of know what we're up against. There's clearly a lot of things that need to change to improve it.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's a single thing out there in each of the three areas that we can agree on the fact that that's not a bad part of the platform.
Okay. So maybe as particularly as you want to go, what are some of the good proposals that you've seen? And what are some of the ones that you think are lacking? We haven't heard from the poverty section of our panel in a while. Would you mind sharing with us, Michael? Thanks.
Well, the reason I wrote that letter, because I was really discouraged about what was going on this campaign, issues that aren't being talked about. What could the government do? Well, I would say since the pandemic, the community service sector has been doing a lot of heavy lifting with the community. And it's been kind of abandoned by government. So while they were all remote working in their offices, well, guess what? We were on the ground. We closed for 2 weeks during COVID because of an outbreak. So they need to recognize their community organizations and support. We're actually trying to buy a building. Just to get quickly, we talked about food security and the environment. There's no problem with food in this country. We waste so much food, so we don't have the facilities to transform food, to cook food. In our food bank, we're trying to buy a building so we can have a kitchen. There's so much food waste that goes on in this country. Guess where it ends up if it doesn't it gets up in landfill sites and that. So there's some local solutions that we could do, but is there something, well, I'm looking for a federal loan program that will help us buy our building. That's what I'm looking for. Hopefully they'll come out with a budget pretty quick. They're going to have to. So we know that, but I'm really discouraged with this campaign because I haven't heard the issues like poverty, child poverty, security, affordable housing. It's affordable rents. People want, like you said, market or whatever. So I like to ramble on, but we hope to see action. We're waiting for the budget, but what I've seen in the platforms has been it's been discouraging.
I will say that I appreciated that at least the Liberal platform didn't just talk about housing, but they did talk about affordable housing. And there were some specific targets for affordable housing and in the context of rent. I think there's much more that needs to be done. So I guess I'm going to answer this question as to whether in the platform or in previous policies, some things that I think let's continue that, or let's press to move further on that. So I'd say just the federal re-engagement in housing with the Liberal government was sorely needed. Again, we had a 30-year time period where the federal government just divested, and that wasn't one party, right? That was successive governments. So the fact that we now have a federal government re-engaging in housing policy is a good thing. Again, we just need to make sure that it is an approach that is consistent with our human rights obligations and with the National Housing Strategy Act that recognizes housing as a human right, which means it doesn't mean that the government has to give everyone a house, but the government having these human rights obligations means that the government and all levels of government and institutions and individual citizens, that governments are responsible to create the conditions where these rights can be enjoyed. So yes, that means investing in housing supply and affordable non-market housing supply, accessible housing supply. But it also means using all the other policy levers available, which include, someone talked about rent controls. All right, so it includes those regulatory powers as well. And they had talked about a tenant bill of rights. So again, it'll be interesting to see what that could become. We have a National Housing Council that does reviews of systemic barriers to the right to housing, and it's looking at its second review just closed for written submissions, looking at the right to housing for women, trans and gender diverse people. So again, they'll be making recommendations to the incoming Minister of Housing, whomever that may be. So there are some things that have begun in terms of federal re-engagement with housing that we really need to press on. Similarly, I would say the Canada Disability Benefit is a new benefit. The regulations were passed. It is like grossly insufficient. Like it's really abhorrent, I would say, how low this is and just how inaccessible, ironically, the benefit is in terms of relying on people to use the disability tax credit to receive this disability benefit. So again, there are some pieces that are either in the Liberal platform currently or that the party has worked on or brought forward that are some small steps in the right direction. You know, the dental care program, the beginnings of a pharmacare program, again, with a lot of pressure from the NDP Liberal coalition. So there are some good things that have started, those signed agreements with the National School Food Program, $10 a day childcare, right? Like there are some good baby steps. But what I'm not seeing, and what we don't hear about a lot, particularly in times of elections when, you know, or in the lead up to the election, you heard a lot of funding announcements, right? Whether it was housing or school food. But what you don't hear about in the media so much are like using those regulatory powers to make sure that employers are doing their fair share and that industry is doing their fair share, and you know, cracking down on privatization and for-profit models in healthcare, and you know, really using the Canada Health Act to make sure that provinces are ensuring that our healthcare is publicly funded and publicly delivered. So again, there are some good things that have begun. There are some things that have some promise in the platform. But, and maybe tying back to the previous question about lobbying efforts, the only thing that's going to move that needle forward is like a massive public either outcry or support that's going to convince them that if they do this, there's the public support to carry them through to the next election. Because even if you have, and I genuinely believe that most people that run as MPs or, you know, that work as ministers or senators, I generally believe that most of them are there because they're trying to do what they think is right to make things better for people. It's not always true, but you know, like for a lot of them. And yet, so even if you have someone that's sympathetic to what you want to do, they've got the rest of their cabinet to convince, and they have like a very small window of like what gets on the legislative calendar, right? So, and our public attention, as we have seen, can be so fickle, right? And so we really need that mass public support to show that we're not going to fall for this scapegoating nonsense. We're not going to pit the environment against people in poverty. You know, we're not going to pit people in poverty against migrants, right? And we have to show that there is this collective demand for our human rights obligations to be upheld. And again, just like raise the bar. But I think they really, really need to know how many people are engaged and invested, are part of pilot projects that are showing what is possible when we use, you know, community alternatives to detention, what is possible when we have mutual aid groups running their own free food banks, you know. So they need to see that that support is there, because, you know, we talk about political leaders, but they won't lead if they don't think the public is going to sustain their support through another election.
Thank you.
Maybe just two thoughts. So Canada has signed international agreements that say if someone comes here and says it's not safe for me to go back to my home country, then they have a right to have their kind of a hearing about whether they're a refugee and not sent back home before then, right? So what is the standard that we're comparing this against, right? We can look at other countries where that is not being respected at this point. So it's a strength of all of the major parties in Canada that they have said they're not undermining the refugee determination process in Canada, but rather suggesting we need to continue to do this and probably add some support, right? The Liberal platform had a mention of increased legal aid for asylum seekers in Canada, which I'm curious what that means, but it's really important, and it's been something that refugee rights advocates have been calling for, so that's fantastic. You know, this has some really good comments about housing for asylum seekers in Canada as well, which I think I didn't really see that in their platform, right? So something to look at. Just on an adjacent topic, so Canada's role internationally, because someone did mention international aid as kind of a topic at the beginning. We saw in the debates and other times some of the parties, including the Liberals, the NDP, talking about the importance of international aid, and the Conservatives using cheap slogans, I would say, to try and undermine it, right? So I see a clear difference there, and I think both as someone who believes in the, you know, our responsibility to our neighbors in other parts of the world, and what that means for Canada's identity as a generous country, you know, there's a lot to like in the parties that want to continue to uphold. Of course, I would say let's push even further, but that's another difference that I've noticed.
Thanks so much, Ian. I think we have time for one final question. Etienne, I think you've got the honors.
Yeah, I guess I kind of wanted to put together, I think, the climate justice thing and like about refugee rights. And I was kind of wondering, generally when we think about refugees, we think about like people fleeing persecution or fleeing war, and that's how they're able to like make a refugee claim. But I mean, is there any like precedent for, you know, we're about to be seeing like a lot more like climate refugees, like people being forced out of their homes because of climate disaster, and is that something that the Canadian government has ever considered, or are they thinking about like considering it that, you know, people saying, you know, I can't live where I used to live because of the climate crisis, is that, you know, going to be a valid refugee claim in the future?
Yeah, so in Canada, there haven't been, as far as I'm aware, any specific programs that have said we're focused on climate refugees. International humanitarian law will say that a refugee is someone who has been forced to flee their country of origin because of a reasonable grounds of persecution. Like they're afraid to stay there. And most people who are affected by climate are moving within their own country, right? Like in Bangladesh, where flooding is a huge problem, it's a lot of internal migration. But then you look at the South Pacific or other types of island nations where there are real concerns, and countries like New Zealand or Australia have had this much more in their political debates, especially in New Zealand, talking about maybe there should be programs for individuals on some of these island nations that are really at risk where they should be granted legal status. So we see this in other parts of the world as kind of an emerging issue. To my knowledge, it hasn't really hit the Canadian discourse in a big way yet. And some people who are fear-mongering about migration, I think, will overstate the threat of climate types of displacement. When really, if we think of, you know, even if you look at the United States, like there's a lot of coastal areas where people are going to have to move, but they can move within their country rather than us worrying about, oh, lots of people are going to come across the border or something like this.
Did you folks have anything you wanted to add to that? Okay. We're just about at time. Jonathan, if you could come up and wrap us. Thank you very much for your questions.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much to all the panelists for being here. I have to say it's a little selfish that I organized this because I wanted to find out what the issues are, particularly in the West Island, but Montreal area, and it's been a fantastic way to connect with you all and to hear some of that. Really thankful to the people online and the people who are here. If I had time for a question, it would be, what can the 50 people gather here on a Sunday morning, 100 at Easter, how can we, what is the impact we can have? And so that would be the question I would give to all of us is how can we have an impact beyond just how we vote in the next election? Very much gratitude to the panelists, particularly the local ones. Little token of appreciation. If you don't need a travel mug, if you see someone with a plastic bottle of water or a Tim Hortons cup, hand this to them. But if you can use it, go ahead and use that. But just a way of saying that we're very grateful to you all for all your time. The other really positive thing is this is like this wonderful round table. I would love just to bring this group of people together for conversation regularly. So thank you so much for being here for that. As I said earlier, I'm a member of the board of Citizens for Public Justice. I've worked with them many times over the years in my national work with churches, and what an incredible resource they are to the churches across Canada and to other organizations as well. So when they asked me to be on the board, it's like, of course, I'm going to be on the board. Just want to point out that there are ways that you can connect with them. Actually, Mario pretty well went through it. If you sign up, you can sign up for the newsletter. You can sign up to be a member. That's the best way to connect with Citizens for Public Justice, to find out more things that you can do to connect you with other people across Canada and in your own community who are doing this work. So take the time. There's a sign-up sheet at the back as well. Good. And the other piece then to wrap things up is there's plenty of time to still talk and engage with each other informally. So again, thank you all. This is a small group. I've only been here 2 months. A year from now, I'll put 100 people in here as we make more connections. Thank you all.
Thanks again, guys.
No, I didn't.
You don't like turkey down there.
Let me